Hey, welcome to another episode of GeekOutdoors.com. Now, on my continuing series on making the move from Windows or Mac to Linux, I wanted to focus on something today that I don't think we really think about as Linux users because we're using it on a regular basis, and that is the user experience. Now, a lot of times as geeks, we really do like to focus on the technical aspects of the operating system. However, for everybody else, we do use our computers day to day and we're not spending all our times running benchmarks. And so that's what I want to focus on today. I'm primarily going to be talking in a lot of general terms in terms of just the overall user experience from somebody who's never really used Linux and who are used to a Windows world primarily. And so this might be something that is real normal for people who do use Linux. However, for people coming from Windows, and I'm going back to when I use Windows, and even now, whenever I do use Windows 10, I do see that a lot of the same things that I had in terms of experience with Windows, they are still applicable today. And so if you have not seen my original video on how I showed you how to install the Oracle VirtualBox inside your Windows or Mac machine, and then after that show you how to install Linux Mint, be sure to check that out in the description below. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move over to my VirtualBox in my Linux Mint 18 install. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is actually the performance when you're actually using a Linux Mint versus the Windows experience. Now, a lot of this has to do with your hardware, okay? But what I have noticed time and time again is that with the same exact hardware, when I am using Linux Mint, things are just faster. Things are snappier. Things just open a lot quicker. I have less issues with performance overall. Okay, now a lot of this, like I said, it does depend on your hardware, but time and time again, when I've tried Linux, specifically Linux Mint, on pretty much the same hardware or even lesser powered hardware, my overall performance is still better on Linux Mint. Okay, so that is first and foremost, and that is something that I think you really grow accustomed to, and at the same time, you forget these performance gains that you get on Linux, specifically when you're going back and using a Windows 10 or a Windows built computer. So there is a difference. Now, for some people, a few milliseconds here and there might not matter, but when you're using your computer on a daily basis, especially when you're using it for quote unquote work, it does make a difference, okay? Gaming aside, I'm talking about real world usage, the things that you do every single day, okay? So that's the first thing. Now, the second part of the user experience, which I feel that it's definitely noticeable right away, is the fact that on Linux, specifically Linux Mint, you don't have constant pop-ups from Windows 10, okay? If you're from the Windows world, everybody is used to constant reminders, constant pop-ups, and constant, I would say, interruptions with you using your operating system. Okay, now in the Linux world, once again, I'm specifically talking about Linux Mint, that's not the case. I mean, it's rare for you to have any type of pop-ups whatsoever. Even when you have messages like, for example, and I'm going to go into this a little bit further, but system updates. You don't get annoying pop-ups reminding you to update your system, okay? And that is one thing that is a huge annoyance to me when I'm using Windows, is that the whole system updates, not only the notifications, but also the constant updates that you get. And so this is another part of Windows that I just really do not enjoy, is the fact that you're constantly getting these system updates. And as anyone knows who uses Windows, whenever you get a system update, it's just not a matter of you updating your system and then you could go on and use your system as usual. Normally what happens is when you get a system update in Windows, you have to actually stop what you're doing, and whenever you reboot your system, it could take anywhere from 20 minutes, 30 minutes, up to an hour or more, depending on your system, okay? Now, obviously, you don't have to update right away, However, there are times when a quote unquote critical update might come where it kind of forces you to update at that point in time, and also the whole update process on Windows, it's not uncommon for you to have the update run into a problem, and then because of that, it either has to redo the update, or in some really bad situations, it can actually wipe out your whole system. Okay, now that is definitely a user experience that I do not miss on Linux. Okay, now are there instances where you have a Linux update where it might cause problems? Yes, that does occur. But how often does that occur? It's extremely rare, unless you are the type of person who does do a lot of tweaking, who does do a lot of distro hopping. The chances of that happening, especially on a stable version of Linux like Linux Mint, it doesn't happen very often. And unlike Windows, whenever you do install Linux updates, normally you do not have to reset your system. Really, the only times that you have to reset your system is when you're having a kernel update or there's drivers updates. Okay, and most of the times that is not the case. I would say 95% of all your updates on Linux Mint, it's rare that you actually have to restart your system. Okay, so pop-ups and system updates, those are the first two areas that I think everybody using Windows can relate with. And then when you are coming into the Linux world, it is completely different because you don't get that, unless you install some software that has notifications turned on and they have pop-ups. Then it's rare. I mean, anybody who uses Linux Mint can attest to that. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is antivirus programs, and I have talked about this before. Okay, now there's always this ongoing debate of Windows security, Mac security versus Linux security. Okay, that debate I don't think is going anywhere. Okay, every single system, no matter what it is, there's always going to be security compromises that can occur. However, talking about a normal Linux desktop user, okay, I've been using Linux, if I remember correctly, for 10 years now. Okay, and in that whole time, I have never experienced an issue with security. Now, a lot of that, number one, and you could debate this as much as you want, but a lot of that has to do with how Linux is built. Okay, and then also a lot of that, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that Windows, as a platform, it's obviously used by more people around the world as their main desktop operating system. So with that being said, there's always debates about that. But when you have that big of a reach, the likelihood of people trying to compromise your system and take advantage of it, it's going to be higher. Okay, regardless of which platform that you are on, that just makes sense. Okay. However, if you actually think about all the security threats, and and if you look, this recent news, there's been a lot of security issues with Linux. Okay, and that cannot be disputed, nor can it be ignored. However, how many people have actually faced real security threats in Linux on a day-to-day basis? Most things, most web servers, most critical systems run on Linux. Okay, and if there were problems out in the wild that occurred on a regular basis, you would see a lot more people have problems, not just on their desktops, but their websites, their banking systems, their stock markets. There's so many things that rely on Linux every day. Our actual network appliances, a lot of those run on Linux. And so with that being said, in Linux, in the desktop version, most people do not have an antivirus type program. That's because, in my opinion, it's not needed. Okay, and like I said, there could be many debates on why or why not that you would need antivirus programs, and also the whole security issue. That's always going to be a debate. However, in real world usage, most people using Linux do not have an antivirus program because they don't need it. Okay, that's just the fact of the matter. So with that being said, I don't have to constantly have antivirus programs scanning things. I don't have to constantly have it draining my performance and so forth. Okay, so that's another thing that the whole user experience in Linux Mint is completely different from Windows, because you don't have to worry about those things. You don't have to think about it as much, and you don't have to have, once again, those interruptions in your daily usage. Okay, so we've talked about the pop-ups, we've talked about the system updates, and now we've talked about the whole security antivirus programs on there. Okay, so another thing that I feel that Linux Mint, the user experience, is different is the fact that you have more control. Okay, and I'm here in my system settings because it's a very simple. I would say a lot of the system settings in Linux. However, it's very powerful as well. There are things that you could change here that would not be available by default in Windows, and in some cases you just cannot access at all unless you have the know-how to do that. Okay, so some of the things, and it's very simple. Okay, you could do this in Windows too, but not to this level of control, is themes. Okay, I've talked about this in other videos. You could change a lot of things just in your themes alone by default, but also if you wanted to spend more time, you could also download software like Compass that allows you to change a lot of those things. Everything down to your windows, the way it looks, even to the way it functions. Okay, but even here in your default settings, there are things that you can do control-wise that you just cannot do in the Windows world. Okay, so it goes back to the whole idea of you owning and controlling the operating system that you are using versus some other company or entity controlling it. And so your user experience is controlled by you, okay, and not the operating system that you are using. Okay, and so I love that part about it, and it's something that I think I'm never not gonna enjoy, because whenever I do have my operating system, I want to feel that it's my operating system, that it's under my control, and it's not under the control of another company or another entity. Okay, so that's another thing. And then that finally leads to the whole user experience of your privacy. Okay, now once again, similar to security, that can be debatable. Okay, but one thing that is really hard to debate is the fact that when you are using Linux, other companies like Microsoft or Apple, they don't have access to your system all the time. They don't have this backdoor or quote unquote secret accesses to your system, and that you have legally agreed to whenever you did decide to install Windows or buy a Windows or Mac computer. Okay, now in Linux, those are not there. Okay, by default, they're not going to have access to your system. I mean, at least for Linux Mint. Okay, and how other distros that might be different. So that is another thing. I really feel like your privacy is very, very important. And I feel like similar to the control thing, you should have control over that. Now, if you are on the internet, that's completely different. When you're on the internet, that is a whole different world. But I'm just talking about your operating system itself. I really feel that your privacy and your control over it is extremely, extremely important. Okay, so those are the main points that I did want to talk about when it comes to the whole experience on Linux, specifically Linux Mint. And there are probably many, many other things that I can think of. Okay, but this is primarily for people who are new to Linux, and not primarily for people who are already really used to using Linux. Okay, but when you're coming from the Windows world specifically, and then coming to the Linux world, you're going to be, there's going to be a period where you have to adjust to this because you're so used to the whole experience that you had on Windows. You're used to pop-ups, you're used to constant system updates, you're used to having security problems all the time. You're used to giving away your information, even unwillingly. And so it's going to take some adjustment whenever you are in the Linux world, and I think that's an adjustment that I could definitely stand behind, because my overall experience on Linux Mint and Linux just in general has been nothing short of amazing. Obviously it is not a perfect operating system, but from a day-to-day use, I enjoy using my computer so much more than when I was in the Windows world. So that is basically it for this particular episode. These are just my thoughts on the whole overall user experience of Linux. And it's something that I really do enjoy and I do cherish. And that's another reason why I do these videos, because I really feel like once people use this system and then get used to it and then really feel the difference on their day-to-day usage, I really feel that it's going to be hard for people to go back to Windows unless they had to. So if you had any ideas on this, the whole user experience in Linux, be sure to leave them in the comments area below. And as always, if you did like these videos, you got a lot of value out of them, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. See you in another episode. Thanks for checking out this episode. And as always, if you like these videos, be sure to click on the subscribe button. And for full written content, audio content, and additional geek stuff, head over to geekoutdoors.com, and I'll see you outdoors on the very next episode.